Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Resilient Advisor Show. My name is Jay Coulter, and joining me today is my ever-popular guest, Lenore Hawkins of Tematica Research. Today is December 9th, 2020. Lenore Hawkins is going to come on and talk about what she sees unfolding in the economy in the U.S. and globally now and into 2021. But as always, viewers and listeners are always curious, Lenore, about what's going on in Europe. You're back in Italy, what you're seeing from a boots-on-the-ground perspective. And I want to remind live viewers, if you have a question for Lenore, simply type in a comment, whether you're on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, and I'll pose the question to Lenore. So, Lenore, what are you seeing in Italy?
Well, I think Europe is, again, just like we were in the spring, ahead of the US. So welcome to the fun that you're going to be having here. I mean, it's getting pretty bad in the US, but it's definitely looking like it'll get worse. So here, what we're experiencing, and I think you won't have quite this much because the US is taking more of a hands-off approach. Trying to get back to the States, for example, flights constantly canceled. You have to rebook. Just the other day, they've just canceled all train service between Switzerland and Italy because each nation has kind of developed its own way of dealing with things. And Italy is getting really tight on how you can get on public transport. You have to check everyone, and Switzerland just can't keep up. So they've blocked now all trains, which is actually very challenging economically because a ton of people live in Italy and work in Switzerland or vice versa. But mostly there's a lot in Italy that go to Switzerland every day to work. And now that's going to get a whole lot more complicated. Borders have just gotten so much more complicated with this whole thing. The nice thing, though, is we're seeing in Europe, because Europe did lock down to varying degrees, but did lock down well before the US with an eye towards Christmas. They're going to try to lighten up a little bit on us in the weeks before, like week and a half before Christmas, and then tighten a lot right around Christmas. For example, all those guys in America who are complaining, you basically can't leave the house on like Christmas Day or the day after. So
well, hang on.
You're lucky. It's a lot tighter here.
So, Lenore, what do you mean specifically that you can't leave your house on Christmas or the day after? What type of restrictions are they putting on the Italians right now?
So for example, if I want to travel outside of my town, my office is in Milan, but my home is in Lake Como, and I can't go to my office right now. I mean, you have to fill out a form explaining why you're leaving your little town. Because if they see you on the freeway, they can stop on the autostrada, which is like a toll road. They can stop you, and then you have to give them this form. And if you don't have the form that you've filled and signed, and the signing says, "I swear this is all true," if you don't have the form, you get fined. If you give them the form and it comes out later that you lied on the form, you pay a big fine. So that's how they're controlling it. I mean, it's not super draconian, but it's enough that people are taking it very seriously. And for example, here, if I walk outside, you have to wear a mask anytime you're outside your house, period. And there's constantly the military and police driving around checking, and it's a big fine if you're not wearing them. I mean, they're not jerks. Like if you pull it down to scratch your nose or something, they're not terrible. But
how much is the fine, Lenore?
What?
Do you know how much the fine is for not wearing a mask?
It can be 300 euros on up to thousands of euros, depending on how severe. They've so far haven't been too aggressive on that, but it really seems to be helping because we're way down from the daily cases that we were at the peak. It's cut by more than half. So unfortunately, this stuff does work. I mean, there's a price, obviously. The economy's not happy about it, but what are you going to do?
Yeah, if you can't leave your house and go to work, the economy has to be grinding to a halt. What are you seeing in Italy specifically?
So restaurants God help them. I have no idea how a lot of restaurants are going to make it. And that's similar to the US in that a lot of restaurants are small businesses. And here they've just been completely shut down. There is no dining, period. The only thing allowed is takeout. There's a lot that I know have given up. Friends of mine who own restaurants, they just quit. So those are jobs that are never coming back. Those are businesses that are never coming back. And those people are going to have to find new jobs, something new to do in an economy that's already struggling. So the US is going to see something similar. Hotels are mostly shut. Lots of restrictions around hotels. So some have stayed open, but pretty tough on that. Retail, very limited. They're opening it up a little bit more right around Christmas, right? Because you want to have that Christmas shopping to try and help the economy. But the number of people allowed in is very limited. Similar to the US, but just a lot worse, a lot more draconian.
Yeah. So that's very draconian. It's not even a little draconian. So then,
I'm used to it.
right? So what do you do? You're a small business owner, whether you own a restaurant or a retail shop. Do you just shut down, declare bankruptcy in Italy, and just wait for this stuff to clear up? Are you completely dependent upon the government? What's the path to any type of relief for these folks?
Mostly it's been family, actually. The government support has been a lot less than what you saw in the US. It's one of the nice things in Italy for people struggling is that Italy has an unbelievably high savings rate, and people have been relying on their families to help them out. That's about what people, I mean, the kind of what the US had with that pandemic assistance and people getting checks. They tried to do that here, and they've done it to some degree, but there's been less help. They've also done the same thing with preventing people from being kicked out of their homes. But I mean, some are just struggling to make ends meet, like get food.
Okay. So what I found interesting about our interviews in the spring is that we kind of saw what was unfolding in Italy through your eyes, and then we saw it unfold here. And I felt like it was a little bit harsher in Italy than most of the US, with the exception of, say, New York City. Do you think, based on the wide lens you have on the European continent, Italy is experiencing a harder lockdown and experience than the rest of the continent? Or can we extrapolate this all the way up through Germany and England?
I think the UK, part of it is kind of a cultural and legal. Sweden and Switzerland have had much lighter lockdowns, and that's just part of the culture. Like Switzerland is sort of said, we're just going to go for herd. I mean, they haven't officially said it, but they really haven't done much of a lockdown. Germany's done a much more rigid lockdown, but that kind of fits with the culture. They're more willing to go along with what the government says. The UK is a bit more like the US, where they're going to fight back more. But in Italy, one of the things you're seeing here is similar to the US, where there's a lot more pushback this time around, saying, look, we listened the first time, we shut down our businesses, for example, for restaurants, and then we spent a bunch of money to try and make it so that it was more coronavirus friendly, right? From changing cleaning to putting up plexiglass, like hairdressers and so on. And then to come and do a lockdown again, no. So there's a lot of pushback. And I think we're going to see some very interesting things, both in the US and in Europe in the coming months, like after this next big wave, and as we start getting the vaccines and the imminent threat of the virus passes a bit, I think we're going to see a lot of political friction, because that contract between the individual and the government that was supposed to be, you're not going to be unreasonable on me, you're not going to destroy me, that's been broken, particularly for these small businesses that did everything they possibly could. And then the government said, well, we're shutting you down anyways. We've seen the protests in the States, particularly from restaurants. Same thing here.
Well, so to bring this over to the US, we're starting to see people walk. So places with more draconian lockdowns like New Jersey, New York, we're starting to see those folks migrate. And this is just isn't me reading a news article. I see it in Atlanta, Georgia. And with my friends up in Tennessee and over in South Carolina, folks are moving down en masse. We have homes in our neighborhood getting bought sight unseen by people from New York City. So
I think we're going to see more of that. I think there's, how we had after the financial crisis, there was the 99%, right, versus the 1%. I think we're going to see something similar this time, and it's going to be even worse, because if you think about what's happened, between the pandemic and the pandemic aid, and then what the central bank did, what the Federal Reserve did, a lot of that has done an awful lot of good for people who owned assets, right? The stock market, and we'll get into this in a bit, but the stock market, new high after new high after new high. So that's fantastic if you were already in the stock market, if you were already invested, you have assets. Home prices utterly exploding. That's fantastic if you own a home. But people who didn't have those assets, who are already maybe not doing so great, they've been hit even harder. So I would expect that we are going to see more political acrimony in 2021 than we've seen before.
Yeah, I don't predict things, but I predict that you are right. How about that? Oh, man. So your colleague, Chris Versace, is watching us. Shout out to Chris for tuning in. Let's use that as a pivot to start talking about why people tune in to us, and that's to talk about the macroeconomy and the implications. As always, Lenore comes with charts. Lenore, where do you want to start today?
All right. Well, how about we look at the percent of people that have been unemployed for 6 or more months? What we have been seeing this time around is something we've just never seen anything of this magnitude. So this first one we're looking at shows you the percent of all unemployed that have been unemployed for 27 weeks or more. And this is just something, this massive increase is something we've never really seen before. And then the next slide is looking at the absolute number of people who have been unemployed for that long. Again, this is something we've just never really seen before. Yeah. This is unprecedented levels of job losses. And then if we go to the next slide, these are jobs that are gone for good. And we're nearing about 4 million. And keep in mind too, those jobs that are gone for good, that's not really reflecting, and this is bad, but it's not really reflecting just as bad as it's going to get. Because think about how draconian these lockdowns, these economic contractions, either the official lockdown or people just saying, oh, hell, I'm not leaving the house, because of how bad it's going to be getting in the coming weeks. We already have, California has issued stay-at-home orders. We've got California hospitals warning that they are either at ICU capacity or just about to hit ICU capacity. And that is what happened here in Italy back the first round. And that is where things really get scary. And that's similar to what Sweden experienced as well. And even Sweden didn't do official lockdowns. Sweden just asked people, hey, stay home, wear a mask, do what you can, but they didn't force anything. And Sweden's economy contracted almost as much as its neighbors who didn't actually have these draconian lockdowns. It contracted similar to them simply because if you're watching TV and you hear that the hospitals are getting full, you're not going to go out, or you're going to be a lot less likely. You're going to be really careful. I mean, you don't want to trip, fall, break your leg because there's no beds available. That, I think, is what parts. Obviously, the U.S. is a very large country and it's the way this virus hits really varies dramatically from place to place. But more of the U.S. is going to be seeing that. So with that, on top of companies who thought, well, the first round, okay, we're going to hang in there, we're going to hang in there, we're going to hang in here. When this next wave hits, they may not be able to really hang in there. And I think we're going to see an awful lot of more permanent job losses. And what's particularly interesting with these job losses, so you see these permanent job losses, unprecedented. Then add in that one of the number one complaints from businesses is an inability to find the right labor. So what we're seeing now is an exacerbation of a problem we already had back in 2019, where companies were saying their biggest problem was they couldn't find the right person for the job. And even now, with all of these people desperate to find a job, companies are still reporting that that's a problem. So in the economy, we really have a deep-seated problem with skills versus job openings. And that just got highlighted even more by this pandemic.
Lenore, let's unpack some of those things in there. So first, the permanent job losses here on this screen. What are those? Are those folks that are working at a restaurant, folks that are working retail, and the stores are just not coming back?
Yeah, those are companies that, we've all heard Yelp reports coming out saying our listings, all of these companies are permanently closed. So those permanent job losses are companies that have said, that's it, I'm out, I'm not coming back. Mm-hmm. And the economy in the US really depends an awful lot on these small businesses. The bulk of job growth comes actually from the small businesses. And even those who do, when you think this through, even those who do make it, who struggle on through, despite the closures, despite the increase in costs, despite having revenue go down and costs go up, they're probably going to have to borrow to get themselves through. They're not going to be able to invest going forward. And that means that in the coming years, their growth opportunities are going to be really hamstrung because of the pain they incurred during this time. And we're also probably going to see a similar thing with many households. They've incurred a lot of debt. Now we've seen revolving the consumer credit, we'll get to that, credit card debt going down, but families really struggling to get through this. And that's going to be scarring them as well. Just once you've gone through something like this, you tend to not forget it. And that will be a bit of a headwind to the economy going forward as well.
All right. So going back to the businesses that have closed, walk through this thought exercise with me. So I'm in the suburbs of Atlanta. There are probably, 15 restaurants for families, a very family dense area, probably 15 within a 1.5 mile radius of my house, right? Makes sense because there's lots of families. So 6 of them have shut down permanently. I have to think once people are allowed out of their house again and can go to restaurants, something else is going to come back in and backfill all those restaurants. So are the jobs permanently gone or just the businesses out of business? And what are the implications there?
Well, we're talking about over a time frame. And think about how much, so people have been forced to stay home, can't go out, right? Families are also struggling now. So it's not that when this is all, and we keep talking about when this is all over as if there's some sort of it's a light switch, right? It's not really going to be a light switch when this is just all over. It's going to be a painful process to get there. But when we do get there, let's say by the summer, we can really open up the economy and people feel safe enough to go out. Their personal family financials are not what they were back in 2019. So going out to dinner, they'll probably start going out, but they're not going to be able to go out as much as they could in 2019 or 2018. That is if they aren't, and this is where I'm talking about that divide, that is if they aren't a family that came in with a decent sized investment portfolio, maybe owning a house or maybe owning some rental properties. Those families who didn't own assets that have gone up so that can kind of help supplement any income. We're talking blue collar versus white collar here. They're going to be continuing to struggle. So they're just not going to be able to go out to dinner as much. And some of those businesses will come back, but the spending from the consumer base is going to be slower.
Fair enough. All right. So with the number of small businesses closing and the number of people unemployed, household balance sheets destroyed, it only makes sense the stock market would be hitting all-time highs.
Oh, obviously. I mean, what else would you have?
Yeah.
Well, there's a reason for that. So one of the really interesting things, if we go to, I think I have slide 7 for you. This shows, keep going. So this one, consumer credit, that one shows, and this I think is fascinating. This revolving consumer credit is basically credit cards. This shows you how scared people are. The amount of outstanding credit card debt has plummeted to a degree we have never really seen before, going back as far as the data is available. And that shows you the degree to which people are really, really nervous.
So I would have thought it would have gone up. I would have thought that revolving consumer credit would go up if people are unemployed. And
people were using, those who can, right? And think about how many people have those credit cards and they could maybe pay them down or they're not spending anymore. Because it's not, it's everyone in aggregate. A lot of the pandemic assistance money, you could see when that money came out, when people were getting those checks, boom, credit card balances got cut because people were nervous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this one, now that red line there, this is looking at the money supply. And this is, when the Fed, that 2.2 trillion, or sorry, with the stimulus that was coming out from the Federal Reserve saying we are going to do whatever it takes. That little red line there, a vertical line, that is how much the money supply has increased this year. Just to give you perspective. So we increased the money supply more this year than as far back as the records go through to the last financial crisis. That didn't even come close to what has been done just this year. So massive amounts of money have been pumped into the economy. But so we've never really seen anything like this. If we go to the next slide.
Hang on, Lenore, before we move on, I'm going to ask you to speculate here. What would have happened if the Fed did not inject all that economy and drive the stock market up?
So remember, I want to say this was April, when the Fed basically came out and said, there's no limit to what we're going to do. And that was Powell came out and said, there's no limit. And the stock market still went down a little bit. I'm convinced that there were some phone calls that went on saying, okay, you guys, to the very large banks out there saying, you got to step in, you got to start buying. Because with that right there, we were at the precipice. Now, if you look at the big picture of the US economy, the only thing that's really keeping this economy in positive growth is actually the stock market. If you look at the actual aggregate household income, removing anything from the stock market, it is not enough to keep the economy really going. And part of that is kind of intuitive when you think how the bulk of the population is actually in retirement, or not the bulk, but the one of the largest demographics, the baby boomers, is actually in retirement. So they're living off of their savings, right? So that's very impactful for them. Then the millennials, which you would hope that they could come in and help out because that's another big demographic. Well, they're saddled with massive student loans. So we really need the stock market to be going up because that helps subsidize spending in the economy. So we really have to keep this thing going. If the Fed had not stepped in and did what it did, the market would have gone down hard and the economy would have been hit an awful lot harder than it was hit already.
The implications of that, though, are wide and reaching, like we talked about here.
Yeah.
All right. So your next slide here on the money stock.
So this one, that red line across the top. So this slide just amazes me. So what this is showing you is the year-over-year change in the money supply. That red line across the top is how much we've seen so far the money supply change year-over-year in 2020. We've never seen anything like this. So this is an unbelievable pumping of money into the economy, except we're not seeing any inflation. So how is that even possible? Well, the next slide can show you how that works.
Yeah, I don't actually have any more slides, Lenore, so you might need to speak to that one.
Okay, no problem. So what happened, why we didn't get that, right? Because everybody says, oh, money printing, and then you're going to get inflation. That's just how it works. Well, there's actually two factors at play here. One is if you increase the supply of money in the economy and the velocity of money remains unchanged, you'll get it. The velocity of money, what that refers to is basically the number of transactions. So if, say, the pace of transactions, is like 10. There are 10 transactions in a tiny little economy that occur once every month, 10 transactions. If you increase the money supply and those transactions are still occurring, well, there's more money available to buy all that stuff. So you're going to have inflation. But if those 10 transactions start to drop down, yes, you've got more money available, but people just aren't buying as frequently. So it counteracts it. And what we've seen in the US economy is, very briefly, the velocity of money dropped below 1. And that is something we've never seen before as well. Why that's happening? Well, if people aren't out there spending, what are they doing? Well, they're saving. So what we saw with revolving credit, that revolving credit, the credit card balance plummeted to a level we hadn't seen before. People are saving. People are saving. They're not spending as much. But where is that money otherwise going? The stock market, because it isn't even just the US, right? So the US, all this money, and this money is going into the financial economy, not the real economy. It's also happening around the world. You've got the European Central Bank doing the same thing, the Bank of Japan doing the same thing, the Bank of England doing the same thing. Tomorrow, for example, the European Central Bank is expected to increase its emergency asset purchase program that's at about 1.35 trillion. It's expected to increase that by another 500 billion. So it's just pumping the money. And that money is pretty much, a lot of it is staying in the financial economy, which is this massive tailwind. That is where we're seeing inflation in the stock.
Well, we didn't plan on talking about this, but may I push you a little bit? Maybe you could help educate me. So I understand the velocity of money concept from a textbook perspective and from an application in normal times. Okay. But when I look at inflation, where I'm experiencing inflation personally, and a lot of folks here in America: food, housing, education, healthcare, entertainment, even Netflix went up. So how can we say, how can the government say there's not inflation when we're experiencing it everywhere?
I actually love this question, because that is the problem with even discussing inflation. It's a really complicated topic because we all toss around the word inflation as if we all mean the same thing by it. And it is a very tricky word to use. Inflation, the way I like to use it, is that you have most all prices in the economy are going up. Now, how do you calculate that? So one of the reasons that the government is saying, well, we don't really have inflation, is the way they calculate CPI. We have inflation below the target. And that takes into account energy prices, right? So we've seen oil prices have been hit really hard, and that's a pretty solid component of the CPI. Food, well, it depends on how you're comparing apples and oranges. You're seeing inflation, except my iPhone here is capable of doing more than my laptop could like 6 years ago, right? So technology is actually seeing prices really plummet. So all of those come together to kind of give an aggregate number. So it gets difficult to really compare apples to apples.
Yeah. The cynic says there's no inflation for the person who has their income or government benefits tied to inflation. For the rest of us, we've got a lot of inflation.
That's true.
Wow. Well, Lenore, tell me, you guys have had a lot going on at Tematica Research here this year. In spite of this pandemic, you've launched some indexes, you have some products over in Europe. Tell us what's happening with the Tematica team in 2021.
So most likely we'll be launching a few more indexes that will support some more ETFs. We have 3 ETFs out right now. Our first ETF is just about to hit the 50 million mark. So that's kind of exciting for us. And we just have 2 others that launched around a month ago. So they're still building. But when you hit the 50 million mark, it's very exciting, because that's when a lot of institutions can come in. Most of them wait until after you hit that mark. But yeah, we really were a bit, I have to admit, we were a bit lucky. Our first ETF came out was cybersecurity and privacy. And it came out right before the pandemic hit. It's like, oh God, because the stock market takes a hit. But it couldn't have been more perfect in that as the pandemic hit, the physical world became increasingly more dangerous. So our lives had to shift into the virtual world, right? We're now doing these Zoom meetings. Everything is we're now watching the news on television. You're quite used to getting to know everybody's living rooms. That was not something that we expected back in 2019. And with that, you've got companies that have completely moved into the virtual world, and more consumers having to live in the virtual world. All of that means that cybersecurity and privacy is increasingly more important. So that worked out really well for us.
And is that the index that has an ETF tracking it with 50 million in it now?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, congratulations to you, Chris, Mark, and the whole team. Thanks so much for coming on. And the next time we see you, we'll be into a new year and hopefully much, much better outcomes for everybody.
We sure hope, right?
Thanks, Lenore.
Thanks.